Mike.
Here we are. Hey, Josh, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm just fine. This is yet another long series of conversations that we've had over the years. Not quite like this.
Last time was probably in. Was it in Baghdad or coming out of Baghdad? I think something.
We
like
had a
that.
nice dinner in
That's
Amman.
true.
I believe
Those were the
was
days.
The Four Seasons, and then we've had dinners in Berlin. We've had we had a dinner in Buenos Aires once.
Mike, your memory is better than mine. Your memory's better. I do remember the Buenos Aires dinner. Yes, jarring my memory.
I thought you might have repressed some of those memories in those days. But anyway, I think we should probably let everyone know that we were longtime Newsweek colleagues.
Yes,
you left about a year ago, and
I left about a year ago, and I'm still basically doing the. Sorry, Mike.
Yep.
On to more unpredictable into more unpredictable terrain, I guess. That of the freelance author, magazine writer. But I have been
well, you've always been somewhat unpredictable.
It's a different kind of game. I'm probably not as wired into the daily and weekly news thing that you are, but I'm getting around quite a bit. I'm on my way to Nigeria tomorrow morning, in fact, down to the Niger Delta, a place I've wanted to go for quite a while. And you just got back, I gather, from Tehran. I've been reading some of your stuff on the web. Yeah, quite an interesting piece you did about the mullahs and the sort of the mood of the street in Tehran, which I thought was
we can talk about that.
Things quite nicely. Yeah,
we can talk about that. I would like to run through some of the really interesting stuff you've been working on freelance wise. But I will just say on a final note, about our past intertwined histories that we do miss the classic Josh Hammer story, which. And there are many different versions of the classic Josh Hammer story, but
are you talking about stories about me, Mike, or by me?
No, no. The classic Josh Hammer product.
Because there are both.
The classic Josh Hammer product was me when I was foreign editor in 2001.
Screaming at me in Peshawar, I remember.
Huh? Yeah.
Screaming at me on my cell phone in Peshawar, Pakistan, yes.
In the middle of the morning meeting, I'll never forget this, in New York on Tuesday, which is the meeting when we decide what the magazine's going to look like the following week, to get the editor's secretary, Mark Whitaker's secretary, running in saying, Josh Hammer's on the phone, he's getting shelled. In the hills, in the hills of Macedonia.
Yes, back in the days when the Balkans was actually on the on the map.
People cared. Yeah. You were under a truck, if I recall. You were under a truck.
That was one of about 5 incidents that in the course of my Newsweek.
You always managed to get yourself shelled and. More important, you managed to get yourself out.
But I don't do that sort of thing anymore. Really, I'd say May 2004 was sort of the turning point. The 9 hours in captivity in Fallujah was kind of a watershed moment for me.
I'm glad to hear that.
But you are still getting around to some pretty nasty places. I don't know if Tehran would qualify as nasty.
No, actually, Tehran would not. Qualify,
I've never actually been. I've never been to Iran. Yeah, so.
Well, it just shows you the gulf of misunderstanding. I mean, so many people think of Iran, and when I wrote my piece for Newsweek, I actually said I too am one of those in a time warp from 1979, flying in there and thinking, that. Before long, I'm going to get a bunch of wild-eyed lunatics ranting at me and possibly taking me hostage, or at the very least, spitting in my face for being a representative of the great Satan. And what I found was, that Iran had already moved a generation beyond that, and is actually quite a thriving, bustling place. In many respects, post-ideological, even though mullah control is still there. It's just this sort of umbrella way above society that does interfere, that prevents, truly free politics from occurring, but nonetheless within that the context of that umbrella, a lot of it is actually a real democracy in many respects. I will say, in 10 days reporting from Tehran, I had far fewer background and off-the-record conversations with people, and that includes everyone from officials of the regime to outsiders to reformists, than I have here in Washington talking to people about the Bush administration. I mean, people in some respects were freer to use their names in dissenting about Ahmadinejad and his policies than you hear people doing here about Bush. So, it is not this sort of monolithic terrorist state that we all read about. And I think one of the more distressing things I heard Condoleezza Rice say in the last few weeks was when she admitted that they basically have no senior-level Farsi speakers at all in the State Department. I mean, a whole generation has gone by without developing that expertise because we haven't had diplomatic relations with them, apparently. So
I don't think we're doing all that much better in the Arabic, although you probably, since you're much more into this you've covered the State Department quite exhaustively over the last few years. Have we made any more? I mean, I assume we've made more progress over the last 5 years, but from what I've heard, not a lot.
Well, anyone who's any good is thereby automatically suspected of terrorist ties because they're too smart or they're too hooked in or whatever.
What is the take on? I mean, you talk to a lot of young people there, people across the spectrum. What is the take on Ahmadinejad generally? Is he admired for his anti-American stance? Is he how do people perceive?
Well,
him
he's clearly developed a populist base. You know, he goes out to the provinces, to the smaller towns. He brings an entourage with him. If someone's door is creaky, or if the local school needs some new desks or a cleaning or whatever, he'll do it right on the spot. It's a very savvy form of demagoguery, if you will. So he has that base. But I will say, I mean, I spent most of my time in Tehran, not all of it. I will say that among the elites, among the intelligentsia of the regime and outside the regime, he's really unpopular. And in an interesting way, it's not so much because of what he's done abroad, although many of the smarter Iranian officials and ex-officials I talked to understand how badly he's isolated the country really unnecessarily because of his outrageous comments on the Holocaust in Israel. But the reason why he's really unhappy is because he's mismanaged the economy. He's helped to drive up the inflation rate by artificially suppressing interest rates. Again, a populist move. He's kind of shifted things back to a command economy after a generation in which the Iranians were moving much more toward a free market economy.
Interesting. And, it's starting to sound a little bit like Hugo Chavez East to me. I've just spent a bit of time over in not actually in Venezuela, but in Bolivia, where you have Morales as a sort of Chavez light. But this is, an oil-based economy with a demagogue preaching to the, who's hugely popular among the masses and somewhat loathed by the elites. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Actually, there are a number of sort of Bush Ahmadinejad jokes. One newspaper editor I interviewed actually said, you Americans, for you, Bush is your Ahmadinejad. Because the Iranians who don't like Ahmadinejad, see them as sort of, of the same ilk, populist, crudely spoken, often using language on becoming of a national leader, which is how they see Ahmadinejad. Very cynically playing to their narrow political bases. In Bush's case, the religious conservatives. In Ahmadinejad's case, the religious conservatives, and not really caring very much what the rest of the world thinks of them. So there are actually jokes going around town about that.
Makes you think the two guys should get together, and Bush could look into his eyes and see a soulmate. So why isn't it happening? You could almost get there, but it's not going to happen with this administration because they abhor this regime. There's the Israel lobby problem, and they simply I don't think they're going to get that far. Although I have to say, having covered Condi Rice and the State Department and what they've been up to, they are edging closer and closer to these talks. These Ryan Crocker talks going on in Baghdad now with the Iranian ambassador were a very significant breakthrough that the Iranians themselves actually put a lot of stock in. I talked to a couple of Iranian officials, including
Mohsen Rezai, the Secretary of the Expediency Council, which is a very powerful body in the politics of Iran, who actually said to me, well, this finally proves that they don't want to change the regime, the Bushies, because they've opened up these talks. So it's not without hope, but I think probably the best case scenario is that we get through the next 18 months or so without a war. Yeah. Bush leaves, perhaps Ahmadinejad is defeated in their 2009 election, and we get two new leaders who can start afresh. So, Josh, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you've been up to? You're heading off to Nigeria.
I'm doing sort of different kind of stuff than it's really a different approach to this game than I'm used to, and I'm sort of slowly getting into the rhythms. I mean, I'm just to give you the rundown of the last few months. I'm writing a lot for a lot of monthlies, so there's a whole different pace involved. I went to Pakistan earlier this year, spent about 3 weeks there doing a big piece for the Atlantic Monthly on Musharraf, and I don't really want to get into too much detail about it, but it was a story that unfortunately one finds working for monthlies, especially when you're dealing with a volatile place like Pakistan, that often the story kind of runs away from you. No sooner had I returned to, actually then living in South Africa, gotten home when, you had this major crisis, which, you could sort of feel the democratic crisis in the beginning of all Musharraf's woes. I mean, the piece was sort of predicated on the notion of what happens after Musharraf.
Yeah.
And in January, it was a highly hypothetical thing. I mean, sitting around trying to make this somehow relevant was a little difficult because it really didn't look like. I talked to Ryan Crocker, who you just mentioned, who was then, as you know, U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, who was basically told me that the United States, in fact, sees a military ruler as the best solution for Pakistan at the time. Is the best solution for, perhaps not for Pakistan, but for American interests. And of course, our relationship with Pakistan is predicated on what's good for us, not necessarily what's good for Pakistan. So at that time, it was clearly, a very beneficial relationship. The U.S. was smiling on him, and it looked like he was destined to stay in power for for longer than Zia, who lasted, I think, 11 years before he was killed. Well, 2 months or a month and a half after getting back home, all hell broke loose in Pakistan. And now I think that really the whole idea of what comes after Musharraf has taken on a lot more relevance, and one can really see. Carlotta Gall has been doing some interesting reporting in the Times, talking about the turnaround in the military. I mean, Musharraf's basic hold on power has always been predicated on or based on his support by the Pakistani military and his support by the United States. I would say that he probably still enjoys a certain amount of support in the United States, but the military is starting to waver now. So it's quite interesting what's happening there. I don't think it's really become a focus yet. It hasn't really hit this sort of, the alarm bells aren't going off about the fate of Pakistan at this point. But I would guess that within the next, you have an election coming up in the fall, and or winter, and I would guess that's going to be a rather big deal.
Now, has he basically? Do you think that Musharraf has created a poison pill politics in Pakistan? Look at that alliteration, pretty good, huh? Poison pill politics in Pakistan, by which I mean rig the system so that if he goes, then you get a rising up of religious parties and candidates in a way you wouldn't have had in the past. And Pakistanis used to point very proudly to the fact that religious parties only got a very, very small portion of the vote. But during Musharraf's term, he's obviously basically banned the main democratic alternatives to him from taking part in the politics. Meanwhile, he seems to have built up this coalition of religious parties.
Well, yeah, and he's also, of course, got alliances. I mean, he's got alliances in a couple of states, with certainly in Baluchistan, along the border, with a religious government. The ruling party actually rules in a coalition with the MMA, the religious parties there.
Right.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, it seems like how much of this is sort of stage managed by Musharraf to create the impression that there is this Islamic Frankenstein's monster that is capable of taking over the country. How much of it is stage managed and just is just not based on perception, image that Musharraf has created, and how much of it is actually something that Musharraf has inadvertently created. It's hard to say. I mean, my feelings from talking to people were that the Islamic parties definitely have gained in power throughout the country over the last 7 years, but that they could never win an election at this point. Now, that's not to say that people are saying, on the other hand, that should this election be rigged, it could create such a sense of demoralization and a feeling of anger at the military and hopelessness about the civilian parties. Well, where do you turn? Where did Algerians turn? You turn to the Islamic parties, So it's a scenario. It doesn't seem like it's a likely scenario, but it's out there.
Yeah. And
it's interesting.
What do you make of the extent to which elements within the government, the ISI, or the military are once again supporting the Taliban?
Yeah, I think that I think that's when you say once again. I don't think it ever really stopped. It seems like it's been going on for ages. I mean, since 2001, I think there've always been elements of the ISI and the army that never really accepted this reversal of policy that Musharraf forced on the country. Which really did come out of left field. I mean, Musharraf himself, as we all know, was one of the most diehard Pakistani nationalists and supporters of the Taliban, although it was for practical reasons and not ideological ones. So, but I don't think there's been any deviation in policy. I think there's a lot of mischief going on. Interestingly enough, I was recently in Kashmir. I went on another assignment. I went to India. I went down for Smithsonian, I went down the Ganges River to do an environmental story. But I took a couple of days at the end of the trip and went up again for the Atlantic. I went up to Kashmir to find out what exactly was happening up there. I talked to a lot of people. People in Indian Kashmir. One good old friend of mine, close friend, very savvy journalist, been there for years, said to me, Musharraf is our messiah. He said, which is not a view that you find pretty much anywhere else, including the United States State Department these days. But they love him in Kashmir. He has really done an amazing job. I mean, since 2005, they have really moved against the militants. They've pretty much closed the border. Something like 90% drop-off in the number of militants who have come across from 2005 to 2007. It's a different place. I was there in 2001 when it was Taliban, Al-Qaeda headquarters. It was a fervent, dangerous place. You go there now, tourists, Indian for the most part, but 100,000, 200,000 tourists expected this summer. It's really amazing, and most people I talk to really do lay that at Musharraf's feet. He really did succeed in squeezing out the ISI there. So on the one hand, at the Indian border, you've got this quite a different situation going on than you have in Afghanistan. It's striking.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the general perception among defense and intelligence experts, here in Washington, is that there's an enormous amount of help that Musharraf, his regime, and leading members of the military and the ISI still give to the U.S. I mean, there's scores of FBI and CIA officials in Pakistan that never get talked about, and I guess the point is that there's a lot of help that he gives out of the public eye, because obviously he's got to worry about the extent to which he's seen as helping the Americans against the Islamists, but that's why he continues to be, quote unquote, our guy there.
And of course, there's just a lot of fear about whether the rest of the military is marching to a different drum than Musharraf
you see some more disaffection there.
I don't want to put all my cards on the table here. The story is still sort of waiting for its slot. But I would say that there's definitely. Let me just say this. I think that Musharraf has been very careful about who he's brought up to the top levels of the Pakistani military. He's really micromanaged that aspect of the government. But I think when you get down to the lower levels, the lower ranking officers, the guys in the field, it's quite a different story. And I think that, those are the people that you really, first of all, those are the people on the ground. Those are the people on the border. They're the ones who are waging war against the Taliban. And they're also the future, if in fact the army is going to keep running the show in one fashion or another. Those are the guys you've got to look at, the colonel, the majors, the captains, the ones who are at some 5-10 years from now going to be running Pakistan. So anyway, we should not belabor Pakistan, although it is a pretty intriguing
it'll
place.
still be there with the same issues the next time we do this or someone else does. So maybe you're right about that. So here I am. I'm speaking to you from inside the bubble of Washington. And it truly
I'm
is.
inside the bubble of my freelance office on the attic of my house. So you're probably,
Are
I'm
you
not
still
exactly
in East Berlin?
turned into the pulse. No. We're out in the green west. We're out in Wannsee, which may ring a bell.
I was just there,
in Wannsee. Were you really? Uh-huh.
Yeah, I passed through with Condi Rice several weeks ago, beginning of June. We were in Potsdam for the G8 ministerial when there was quite an interesting run-in between Condi and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, over the missile defense system. And I wrote a piece saying, "Boy, this is almost like Potsdam 60 years ago when there was all this happy talk, but meanwhile the Cold War was starting."
Right.
I think things have calmed down a bit since then.
They seem to have.
Putin's in Kennebunkport.
Putin in Kennebunkport, yes.
But the Russians are certainly playing their own game, and
I don't know. Putin's popularity is astonishing. I was watching Jim Clancy and the crew doing. I don't know if domestic CNN is doing what international is doing, but they had a whole week in Russia, a country that I really don't know. But I was just amazed at the popularity of Putin. I mean, he was Clancy had assembled a group of young people, and it was this kind of universal satisfaction with the guy. I guess things like journalist murders and murky KGB activity and all of that stuff. Just people just don't seem to care about it very much.
Well, it's the U.S. officials I talked here say it's actually a new kind of political form that's evolving that most resembles perhaps 1930s fascism, except they don't really want to call it that because that has so much baggage to it. But it's a corporatist type state. He's put his KGB pals in charge of the state energy companies, other companies. And if you recall, that's what fascism was. Nominal, some nominal democracy is retained, but with increasing control from the Kremlin. And I guess on the theory that people get the kind of government they deserve, maybe that's what the Russians really want.
So the outrage that we saw over over the Politkovskaya murder, I believe it's Politkovskaya, right?
Politkovskaya,
yeah. I mean that the outpouring in the streets was really just a handful. I suppose her colleagues and a couple of thousand people. But what I don't know. I don't know how tuned in you are to the pulse of Russia. Have you traveled there with Condi? Have you talked to people
I've
in the
been
streets
there.
of Russia? Do these kind of incidents register with people? Is there just kind of a shrug of the shoulders and that Putin has made?
They don't. These are not mass demonstrations of the kind the various color.
It's something that we in the States, we members of the Fourth Estate here, find so outrageous and yet kind of greeted with apathy and a shrug of the shoulders.
In fact, when a year or so ago, when Putin, seized control of the state governorships in yet another anti-democratic move, we did a story on the only lonely protest that was conducted at the time, which was by the old Communist Party against the anti-democratic move. So, no, you're right. He's hugely popular, and so just another worrisome sign there. And we're just waiting for the next Russo-German anti-aggression pact.
Right.
Wait for that to happen. So anyway, on other fronts, well, I was just saying, I'm here in the Washington bubble, and you get around more than anyone I know. I mean, I think you probably have been to more places than any correspondent I know, and I know a lot of the places you've been because we've communicated from there when I was an editor or writer in New York or Washington. What is, just give me some sense of let's give Washington viewers a little reality check on how Bush and the Americans are viewed in most of the places. Is there any place apart from Albania where Bush?
I'll tell you. It's interesting about Albania. There's a phenomenon here that I think is.
I knew
really
you knew about Albania.
Well, I haven't been there lately. I mean, I was there in Kosovo time. I think you must have passed through during that period, right? Did you ever?
I kind of brushed by the border.
Tirana?
I brushed by the border.
Interesting place, but it's not. It's an Eastern European phenomenon. I'll tell you. I have when I was living down in Cape Town until last March. Some of our closest friends that our kids went to school together was a Romanian couple. Who had been there for the downfall of Ceausescu, lived through the revolution there, and they were both doctors, doctors, had emigrated to South Africa, had lived there for about 10 years or so. They were, without a doubt, the most diehard supporters of George Bush that I have ever encountered. And there is this phenomenon. It's interesting. You have Enver Hoxha in Albania. You have Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. These both products of a totalitarian, a twisted, psychotic, sadistic totalitarian society. Really, those two are probably the worst. I think Albania and they both ended. Well, Romania, of course, the revolution was a violent one. Albania was less sort of violent than just sort of prolonged anarchy. But it just shows you the kind of pernicious effects of those years. But those people, I'm drifting away from my theme, but this couple saw these and what was going on here was very clear. There was an intense parallel that they drew between Saddam Hussein and Ceausescu, and they were absolute supporters all the way down the line. Bush could do no wrong in their eyes. Yeah. And we used to have these endless conversations, endless arguments about it into the night that just ended up going nowhere. They just could not be persuaded. This was in their view, this was an absolutely heroic action that very few they saw it as an act of tremendous courage, moral decency, and Bush in their eyes was a hero. Very much so as you saw the reception in Albania. So it's interesting. I mean, there's a paradigm here, and I think that this is something that you see
Albanian paradigm
throughout the former Iron Curtain paradigm. Call it what you want. The Poles love him too. Although I think the Poles are starting to temper themselves a bit, but the Eastern Europeans still see. I think if there's one corner of the planet that remains very much pro-Bush, and again, lately I haven't been to Eastern Europe, I've been to Sarajevo fairly recently, where I think that Sarajevo is still a place that it wasn't so much Bush. It's just a very pro-American place. I mean, they view this as America. America essentially finally ended the war there, so it doesn't matter if Bush.
And we don't get
whoever,
Americans don't get much credit in the Muslim world in general for having.
It's probably one of the few Muslim countries, that in Albania, where there is a residue of great support for America. So, but I spent much of my time traveling in South Asia and Africa and places that I think the loathing of George Bush is probably a bit less intense in Africa. But certainly, it's probably this is where I am right now. This is probably one of the great bastions of anti-Bush sentiment.
I get the sense in talking with other governments, officials, everyone is just basically waiting for the 18 months to be up.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of interest.
Disastrous presidency to be over.
Yeah,
and then they can start picking themselves up out of the rubble. I mean, they're already, and Bush, of course, would already be entering a lame duck phase, even in the best of times. But it's, everyone understands that he's sort of really living in his own bubble and a little bit out of touch with reality.
But it
doesn't.
It does look like some Democratic president is going to have to pick up, and it feels to me. You live in the States, but it just feels to me like this is a Democrat. Democrats would have to be quite inept, and they have been.
Yeah, it's theirs to lose.
To lose
it's
this
Hillary's
one.
to lose,
but
actually.
It's Hillary's to lose, but they're still going to be left with this tremendous mess to clean up, and because I believe it feels to me like the policy now is just simply run out the clock. Although I'm curious to see how in Iraq, of course, I'm talking about how it is going to what happens when this September day of reckoning comes around.
Yeah.
Where are things going to stand at that point? Because
I don't think there's going to be a day of reckoning. I think that's really a red herring, and I've been told by pretty senior officials who oversee the Iraq policy that they don't really expect things to look any better in September, which obviously is getting closer now. This is early July, than they are now. There were always horribly unrealistic expectations raised by the Bush people, by Petraeus, about the surge and how long it would take. Petraeus finally came clean a couple weeks ago and said, look, counterinsurgencies take like 10 years to conduct and to win. And, it was always absurd to think that in 6 months or 8 months you're going to get some sort of a dramatic turnaround, which obviously you're not getting at all. And now there's all these questions about the effectiveness and basic competence of the Maliki government. So so I don't expect anything to change there, and it's it's a virtually intractable situation. I don't know about you, but I've basically decided I'm not going back to Iraq. I've been there a total of 3 times for a month each, and the last time I was there, I actually felt a little guilty about being there. I'm the father of 2 sons, and I said, this is just crazy. This is just the worst possible.
Were you embedded, Mike, or what?
I did an embed with some MPs going out on patrol, and I went up to Balad Air Base and did a story out of there on how we were sort of permanently putting down roots.
Yeah, the permanent basis thing. I saw that. Right.
But I spent a lot of time.
And when was that?
Zone. That was a year ago, April.
So I was there basically a month after you.
Okay.
My last trip was in May 2006. I went down with the British in Basra. Spent a few days there.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. I'm kind of amazed that I actually got up the nerve to go back there after my May 2004 experience, because I really did think that I was in Daniel Pearl territory there.
Yeah, well, you were very dangerously close to Daniel Pearl territory from
I was.
From what I understand.
Nick Berg, as I pointed out a few times, was in the same town and possibly the same block. While we were in captivity. So, but somehow it took me about a year and a half to summon up the nerve. I went back in December. Even went back to Fallujah. It's in the company of a John McCain type convoy of Marines surrounding me as I went in to watch the elections back in December 2005, I believe.
Yeah.
Then I went back again in May. But I do want to go back, because I would on the one hand I would like to be able to read the mood of the American soldiers there and just see what exactly is happening on the ground. But I do feel at this point that, let others do it. Let others. Let younger people who don't have kids.
Right.
I just think it's too big a risk.
I mean, the worst part of it for me psychologically was that particularly when I went there last time, I really didn't want to take a lot of risks. But, if you sit there in the green zone, you feel guilty journalistically.
Of course.
What am I doing here? I could be
Although
in Washington.
These days,
these days the green zone is more
mortars
dangerous.
falling in the green zone. Exactly.
Yeah, actually one.
you can do a piece on Crocker, and you could probably follow around Petraeus and do those kinds of stories. But essentially,
you got to get out there, and
of course you do.
Once you get out there, then it becomes too risky for my taste, at least at this point. But I don't know. What's your take? I mean, I think that it's
no. My take all along is, as I was right after Petraeus took this job, I had spent some time with Petraeus, as probably every journalist in Iraq has been charmed by Petraeus at one point or other, and gotten his little 10th Mountain Division, or what is it? What was not 10th Mountain Division? Sorry, what was his?
He was the 101st.
101st Airborne.
I was with him when he was
his little coin, back up in Mosul that he handed out to everybody who came through. I mean, Petraeus was just an incredibly warm, open, accessible, impressive guy, and then I followed him again when he came back to remember Newsweek ran a cover, I believe, which I initiated the reporting on, and Rod Norland followed up about, can this man save Iraq? I believe this was
which almost cost him his career, by the way.
Did it? Well, I'm just wondering, is this guy, I'd like to hear about that, but I mean, now this guy's come in again as our man in Iraq, and I mean, I think Petraeus is a hugely impressive guy, but, what happened with that Iraqi security force that he was supposed to take over and transform, and what happened with this surge that he was promising would turn things around? Am I right that maybe that's going a little bit too far? There was a bit of caution.
He was,
but I mean,
no question.
I mean, is this a guy who's failing upwards, or is he the best we've got in a situation that just cannot be fixed, or can one lay any of the blame on this at Petraeus' doorstep? I don't know. I mean, I don't.
Well, you can make the argument, that he was named.
Can anybody fixed it? Why does he go into
the skipper of the Titanic after the iceberg?
Yeah, true.
And it was unsalvageable. What we do know is that Petraeus was coming in to essentially reverse on Bush's orders the policy of the previous couple of years under General George Casey, which was Iraqification, which was withdrawal into the big super bases like Balad. And let the so-called Iraqi security forces that were supposed to be ready handle it. And by the fall, it became clear that that was just not going to work. The Iraqi security forces were not ready. The Maliki government seemed to be teetering, and they did basically a 180, which is Bush saying, "Okay, we've got to go, and we Americans are going to be doing the frontline patrolling."
But the American forces were just too small to do it, correct?
And still are.
And still are.
They're still playing whack-a-mole.
The idea that you could send this small force in at this late point in the game always struck me as illogical, and I was just amazed that Petraeus was willing to take on that responsibility and that leadership at possibly the risk to his own reputation and career. So I don't know. Is he going to come out of this unscathed? How do you assess?
I don't think anyone comes out of it unscathed. No. But he's got his 4th star, and he's definitely one of the Army's best and brightest. Ryan Crocker's one of the diplomatic services best and brightest.
Right.
So there's a sense that these guys can't do anything with it. No one can.
Right.
But I do think that they're going to get back to Baker Hamilton increasingly. There aren't any coherent plans. I've been writing about this for some time now. The whole idea that there's a coherent strategy for getting us to like South Korea, as Bush alluded to a few weeks ago, or back to Baker Hamilton is just nonsense. They're not really moving in that direction. They just seem to be drifting sideways, and so I think that they're going to gradually ratchet down the force, but probably not until sometime well into 2008. And,
how low do you think it's going to go? What do you predict will be the size?
Well,
of the
the original
force by the
plan
time Bush
under Baker Hamilton was to have something like 50 to 60,000 combat troops with maybe 30,000 in support. And I think that's where they're heading back to that idea, where you have rapid reaction forces, you have special forces going after Al Qaeda, but you're not doing the sort of frontline patrolling that's happening right now. The problem with that scenario, and one of the reasons that Bush did the surge in the first place, is they came to realize that Al Qaeda was not a steady state. Al Qaeda in Iraq was not a steady state. You had a situation where if you let the Shiite militias go after Sunnis, then the Sunni population was going to continue to support Al-Qaeda, and we couldn't just let that go. We couldn't just sort of hunker down on our big bases and let that situation emerge, because then you're generating roots for Al-Qaeda. So that's one of the reasons they decided to go after it aggressively. But I mean, there are some hopeful signs in Anbar province where some of the Sunni tribals,
some of these sheikhs have turned around,
doing their own policing against Al-Qaeda. But I mean, the bottom line is this is a long-term operation. Petraeus and the Bush people were really not forthright about that at the very beginning. They needed to say, look, we're doing a 180 on the previous plan. We're going to be in there 10 years. That's how long it's going to take, and they just couldn't bring themselves to do it because it was so politically toxic to say so.
Right.
So now they're paying the piper because there's all this disillusionment about, the surge didn't work,
Right.
When any military expert you talk to, counterinsurgency expert, said the surge was always going to take a long, long time. Right. So, it's a mess. It's about as close to being an intractable quagmire as I've ever seen in my lifetime, and the only hope I see is
I think
like
we
the
can say that.
plan.
I think that we could. Would you say that? Is it your sense there that it's bottomed out, or it's reached
that's the tragedy of it.
A level of hideous violence, and yet since the surge began, it doesn't seem to have accelerated. Now, granted, 50, 75 people dead violently a day is not something to be, sanguine about, but it hasn't worsened. It sort of, again, it seems sort of, I don't know. I think there is a kind of consensus that it's reached a civil war state, but how do you quantify it? Where is it?
Well, I mean, the scary thing is psychologically, and there's been some reporting about this. There was a story in the New York Times, I think, a few weeks ago, that this sense that psychologically the Shiites and Sunnis have really just begun to fight. You got a lot of years of pent up frustration. Obviously, Sunnis
one
feeling
can see
oppressed.
that with the Balkans.
And,
I mean,
right.
what finally turned around the Balkans was exhaustion after, but how many?
Right.
200, 300,000 dead. Yeah.
Right. Right, and I think that state of exhaustion, they're not even close to that, and it's also the tragedy of Afghanistan, to my view. I mean, I think one of the strategic tragedies, catastrophes, is how little attention was paid to Afghanistan as we shifted so quickly to Iraq, because I think the Afghans were exhausted. I think they were in that exhausted state in 2001 after 23 years of civil war, and had we exploited that situation and really moved in with some resources and attention, we could have rescued that situation. By contrast, the Iraqis, had their passions were so tamped down by Saddam for so many decades that now they're really getting released. And so I just think it's going to go on and on and on for several years.
One has a feeling, certainly in Afghanistan, of a kind of a steady creeping upward. Nothing really dramatic, but definitely the suicide bombings are increasing. The attacks seem to be growing. You've had several quite nasty attacks in Kabul the last couple of months, which was at some moving along. I was in Kabul most recently in March, and there was a lot of optimism there. A feeling that maybe down in the south, the rest of the country. Southeastern Afghanistan is highly unstable, but we're on a track here. We're developing. I guess it's a bit less secure now. There have been a couple of major attacks in there, and Karzai and his government had gone to great efforts to keep Kabul an island of security. So when the attacks start happening in Kabul, you have things to worry about.
Now we got suicide car bombs having been exported to Kabul, to Afghanistan, and apparently now to Glasgow,
Yemen,
Scotland. What's next? Right. IEDs in the streets of Manhattan. They can be
laughing about that.
Become a giant terror factory. Those failed efforts. So
so it's a pretty grim picture all around, as usual, I suppose.
Yeah, and I know that you're usually such a jolly guy, Josh, and I am too. But do we have anything? Do we have any positive words with which to leave
Well, I'm looking forward to Acadia National Park. How about that? I don't think I'll be running into any IEDs there in July. Yes, so that's.
Watch out for falling rocks. Yeah.
Right. What about you, Mike? What are your?
That was my last brush with danger, by the way. A large falling boulder in the Alborz Mountains of Iran, heading toward the Caspian Sea. Landed on the roof of our car and actually penetrated the metal. So
yes, did you see any?
Beware of that.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Any members of the Mahdi army up there pushing them down?
We were not able to track them down. But
so we've done 45 minutes. This has been good.
All right. Well, I wish we had some thematic wrapping up to do. I guess. The only thing
I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it to our fearless media mogul Bob Wright to probably interject himself, maybe at some point, and I don't know, and offer some pearls of wisdom. I don't know if that's technologically feasible or not, but I think we should end it here. And it's been great talking to you, and we will.
Good talking to you, Josh.
If we're ever invited back, I look forward to it, Mike.
All right, man. Have good luck in Nigeria.
All right, take care, man. Bye-bye.
Take care.